So welcome to another in the OpenAir webinar series. Today's topic is reporting and tips and tricks, and that's a pretty broad topic. So today what we've decided to do is focus on a specific type of tip and trick as it relates to transaction dates. And I think we're all very familiar with the fact that there's tons of dates in the systems and which ones are the right ones for you to be using, and how those dates factor into reports and how you can filter data based on those reports. Before we get into that topic, let me tell you a little bit about what's going on with TopStep and the OpenAir community. We are doing our OpenAir user groups. So tomorrow actually we'll be in the Baltimore area, Maryland area, to do an OpenAir user group that's going to be hosted at the location of OpenText. So thank you for those of you who are on the phone. Our San Francisco one is actually scheduled for Friday, April 10th, so that's coming up pretty quickly. Our friends at Navis are going to host that. And we have another one scheduled for Chicago area on Friday, April 17th. We've got a few bids out there to see who would like to host it. So if you are interested in hosting that one, please feel free to send me an email. We are trying to finalize the location. For those of you who have never been to a user group, the way they work is it's really just getting the community together. TopStep buys lunch, and we usually propose a topic for us to discuss, or just bring questions that you may have, and we turn it into more of an ad hoc consulting type activity. And it's really a good way to sort of share experiences and what's working for you and what's not working for you with your fellow users of the system. Our next OpenAir Expert Webinar Series is next month. It's going to be Thursday, April 16th, and we're going to focus on the topic of project management and methodologies and how you can use features and functionality, especially some of the new features that came out in 2014 related to project management. And finally, it's coming up fast, believe it or not, but the first week of May is SuiteWorld, and we will be a silver sponsor this year. So if you are planning on going, we'd love to have you stop by our booth and say hi in the expo. If you're not planning on going and are interested, you're free to definitely contact us and ask us questions about what it's all about and what you'll be able to get out of it if you attend. Okay, so we look forward to seeing everyone out there. So let's get into this whole reporting tips and trip topic related to dates. So here's the topics that I'm going to cover, and these are, agendas are always high level. But what I'm going to talk about is what's in a date, like what does a date mean, and then what are the different types of dates that you can have in the system. I'm going to focus on a specific type of date that some of you may or may not be familiar with, and that's called accounting dates. It's something that introduced a few years ago, but it's really sort of an optional date that has functionality tied to it that you can consider. And then we'll get into the topic of date filtering. What the heck does date filtering mean, and how does it relate to reports? And of course, then we'll do a wrap-up. So what's in a date? So as many of you know, every transaction in OpenAir at least has two types of dates, created and updated. Okay? But for many transactions, they have a lot more than just those two date fields. Some of the transactions have dates that are related to some kind of action so that you understand when did the action take place, what did the action do, and what caused the action to happen. Workflow is a great example of this. You have things like timesheet submitted date. That's because somebody submitted the timesheet on this date, and timesheet approval date because somebody on this date approved the timesheet. So those are all action type dates, and some of those are the dates that you care about when it comes to reporting. Approved dates, maybe doing a delta between submitted and approved to see how long it takes for people to approve timesheets that have been submitted, those kind of compliance monitoring dates. There's another whole set of dates that are really sort of planning dates. So dates, things like scheduling resources, so depending on how you're doing resource management, it could be tasks start and end dates, it could be bookings start and end dates. Planning for tasks, like the start and end date of a task, or being able to put dependencies or predecessors on a task, and having the dates all compute automatically. Forecasting when a project starts by setting the start date on the properties form. Those are all dates that are scattered throughout the system, and of course those may all be dates that are important for you, not only from seeing the data visually in some kind of graph or report, but also to be able to keep track of when things have to start and stop. Obviously that's why the dates are there. And dates, of course, are always key to audit trails. So If those of you who may be familiar with the detail reports, there's always a field on all the transaction types called audit trail that you can add into the report, and it shows you for the life of that particular record what has happened to it, when did it happen, and who did it, okay, including things such as who proxied as somebody. And audit trails are a really powerful way to sort of track back and are used by your administrators many times in your help desk to investigate what the issues are, how, why are you seeing what you're seeing, or why is the data not matching what you expected it to match, and the audit trail can be a big part of that investigative activity. So I try to go through and think about the dates that are in the OpenAir system and think in terms of how would I group the dates. I mean, obviously we all know what a date is, and hopefully folks on the phone know that you can always control the date format based on your personal settings. So you can do day, month, year, or month, day, year, or year, day, month, or all kinds of stuff like that. But really, what are the dates in the system, and what do they mean in the system? What is it, just because it says something like the 15th of March, what does that mean to me? So what I did is I kind of grouped them into different types of categories. So there's every record in the system, and when I say record, I mean things like the project page, the user demographic page, a time entry, a receipt. All of those are transactions that are stored in the database. And every single one of those records has a created date and an updated date. So I call that the record creation modification date. Okay? So even if you did some kind of, if you updated somebody's last name, that user demographic record would get an updated date, for example. Then the other type of date that I kind of group together is dates that mean workflow completion. So these are the submitted date and the approved date, and we're going to get into where can you find those dates, where are those dates very visible or used as filtering on reporting. So I call these workflow stages. So timesheets have these kind of dates, expense reports, invoices if you have the approval processes, purchase requests, purchase orders if you have those processes in place, revenue containers have this, booking requests, bookings, lots of workflow in OpenAir, and anything that you have some kind of approval rejection type workflow would get these submitted and approved dates in the system. Then there's sort of relationship dates. So a time entry can have a date. So I did the work on the 15th of March, but then if I actually run that time entry through a billing rule, the charge that's created may have a creation date of April, but the date of the transaction is the 15th of March because that has a relationship back to the way that the time was entered. The time was entered on the 15th of March. So I kind of called those relationship dates because you sort of inherit the value of the item that you're related to. A charge inherits the value of the time entry date for the time that's being processed through, but it gets a different created date, a different updated date, for example. Then there's calculated dates. So OpenAir does have a number of areas. This is specifically in the project area that it will compute what the date should be. So if you set the start date of a project, okay, which actually defaults to today's date if you don't change it, if you set the start date of the project and you add a bunch of tasks to the project, if those tasks all have 0 hours, then they're all going to assume the start date of the project unless you change that. However, if you put something like 80 hours on a task, 120 hours on a task, and you assign it to a person, the system will compute how long it will take to finish that task if that person is dedicated, for example, at 100%. There's a percentage of time field on the task form that allows you to control the time dedication of the person. In those situations, if you are not physically typing a start and end date in, the system is actually computing those dates for you. It will take the start date based on the project start date or whatever dependencies you've put in there between tasks, and then it will take the number of hours that are associated to the project or the project task and the people that are assigned to it, and it will compute how long it would take somebody during normal working hours, the work schedule, to compute and finish off that work for those number of hours, and that will compute a finish date. So tasks have calculated end dates. Project has calculated end date. So So a lot of times I'll see customers, or I'll even have a need where I need to say I need to report on the project start date and the project end date. And the project end date does not actually exist. It's maybe a custom field in your account, but the word end date does not exist. It is calculated finish date is what's available, and that actually is a calculated finish date based on how the task structure is set up in the system. Then I have this like container relationship, which is different than relationship to input. So relationship to input, I thought in terms of, like the billing rule, processing time, the charge that comes out gets the same date as the time entry, okay? Although the creation date is different. The container relationship is more related to things like timesheets with time entries or expense reports with receipts. And that's where you have different dates associated with the container than you do with the individual entries. So you could create a timesheet today and not enter time into it until 2 weeks from today, for example. So there would be vastly different created dates associated to the container versus the time entries. But there is a relationship usually between what the time entry time frame is and the time entry date. So you can only put time on the 15th for a timesheet that covers the week or the semi-month or the month of the 15th, for example. And then there's the accounting relationship. So there's this accounting date functionality. It was introduced quite a number of years back, but the accounting relationship is something that uses another field that can pop up on a lot of forms in the system called accounting date. And that field can be something that you manually enter. It's something that you can have the system set for you. It's one of those in-between date fields, I like to say, because all the dates that I've talked about up until accounting are all system generated. You touch something in the system and it sets the date. You create a record, it sets the date. You submit the timesheet, it sets the date. But an accounting date puts a foot in both worlds. It's both something that you can manually adjust, and it's also something that you can have the system set automatically. And we'll talk more about that in detail in just a second. Then, of course, the final one is just adding custom fields. And custom fields, in today's world, the manual dates can actually be a little bit of a gray area because up until probably a year ago, manual dates were just that. You put a date field on there, maybe projected completion date of a project or project end date. You have to manually fill that in, okay? The introduction of the scripting feature, of course, has sort of changed that a little bit. So now you could have some of these date fields that you've personally set up be pre-populated or populated based on actions or activities that have been taken in the system, and then a JavaScript that you may have commissioned or wrote yourself would set these dates automatically. So the manual dates are just that, they're manual dates, but with the world of scripting now, they can have a little bit of automation behind the scenes on here. So with all these kind of dates, really the craziness is now I need to run reports. What date should I be using? Because a transaction can have widely different dates on it depending on what action has taken when and when I did certain things and when I did the submission and when somebody approved it and when I created it and when I had to change my name. And lots of different activities would change dates related to a single transaction. Okay. But before I go on to the reporting filtering, I thought I would spend a little bit more time going through the accounting date function. It's a function that for companies that are actually getting the OpenAir system in more recent times, like the past year or two, I believe it's already activated as part of the provisioning of the system. But if you're one of the customers that have been using the system for quite some time and you're not using this functionality yet, I thought I would take some time, go through this in a little more detail, because this actually can be quite powerful and may end up being a lot of the date default drivers that you use in the system using this accounting date functionality. So what are accounting dates? Okay, the accounting date in OpenAir is not as strict as an accounting system, but it is another date that shows up on transactions, and all the transactions that it shows up on have a relationship to some kind of accounting activity. So receipts, expense reports, invoices, revenue, time entries, timesheets, all of those, if you turn on the accounting date functionality or if it's already on, the accounting date functionality adds one more date field to a variety of forms. If you have the accounting date feature turned on and you're not seeing the accounting date on these transactions, you most likely have somebody, your administrator may have done an adjustment to the form using form permissions to hide that particular field, but it may still actually be used and available and set behind the scenes. The accounting dates in many of these transactions are something that you can specifically use in a summary report. And the summary report date to use section, which we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail, if you drop that value down, does have a number of values related to accounting date. And I have a screenshot of that coming up here in just a second. So how do you use this accounting date? So first off, you have to have it active in your system. And when you have it active in your system, it shows up in your general administration area. So let me go into the system here. If I go into administration, you'll see that under organization on the left-hand side, you'll see accounting dates. Okay? So that's how I know it's turned on and when I see this word accounting dates in the system. Now, when you turn it on, all the accounting date fields will show up on that list of transactions that I showed on the previous slide. So charges and invoices and revenue, all of those will show the field. So when somebody's putting their expense report in, when they bring up the receipt form, they may see an accounting date and ask the question, well, what is this date for? What do I put in here? So that's where the form permissions come in, where you would probably hide that from everyone except an administrator if you need to see that as an administrator. Okay. And you can manually set the accounting date in the system for different types of records. But typically what I see is when people are using the accounting date function, what they're doing is they're actually enabling the automated part of setting the accounting date. So when should the accounting date be set and what date should it get? So that's what that accounting date configuration is on the administration page, is how are you setting up the system to be able to store or set that accounting date. And let's take a great example here is with the timesheet. So I'm going to go in the system here, open up the accounting date. And for each accounting date, so these are all the different types of transactions that can inherit an accounting date. Okay? What event would set the accounting date? So automatically accounting dates are blank. Okay? So if you pull down the event, for timesheets, if you want to automate the way the accounting date is set for timesheets, you can base it on whether it's created, submitted, or approved. And the multiple times that I've worked with customers in working on the accounting date, a lot of times it does actually is timesheet approval because that tends to drive something like maybe the time is eligible for invoicing or it's something that's used in utilization reporting, so maybe the accounting date is linked to approval. But it's completely up to your process as long as there's a clear understanding of what is behind the accounting date that's being set. Okay? So that's great. I picked the event, but what date does it get? Okay? Well, I can actually define that as well. So once the timesheet's approved, the date that it will get is, and then I have these options here, which are the standard date fields associated with the timesheet. Maybe when it started, created, submitted, or approved. But then there's a couple other options here. One called custom date, which is sort of hard coding it. So if the timesheet's approved, you're hard coding it to have this date. Something that would most likely require a lot of maintenance, you having to go back into the system and every month maybe changing it, for example. But the other option is something called the accounting period. And that's what we're going to talk about next. What is an accounting period in OpenAir? And an accounting period basically gives you a way to sort of set up an accounting calendar, so to speak. So you can define, like in the example of my drop-down here, I can define the different months in the year, and they are each an accounting period in our organization. And at any given time, I can determine which of these is the current period by identifying that current period. So I could either hard code a timesheet approval to always set one of these specific accounting periods, or I can simply say just set it to whatever the current accounting period is, which is much more maintainable because as a timesheet's approved, whatever current accounting period that I'm in, that time would be included in reports as applicable or accrued or booked against the current accounting period. Okay. So what is an accounting period? Accounting period is a way for you to define not only an accounting calendar in the system, but to be able to use that accounting calendar to associate a dedicated accounting date to use specifically for accounting. so that you can run reports in OpenAir and you can reconcile to an accounting period that may be defined in your accounting system or your ERP. Okay. Now, an accounting period in OpenAir, how can a transaction get an accounting period in OpenAir? Well, the answer is even though the accounting period gets a name of something like January 2015, under the covers, there's actually just a single date associated with it. So even though we're talking in terms of periods, behind the scenes, that period is really just driving a single date on the transactions, which becomes the accounting date. So a lot of times accounting periods are set up so that you can use like a quote-unquote current accounting period and set it up in things like revenue recognition or billing rules or even those accounting date settings. And then whatever the current accounting period is, that's the date that would be applied in the accounting date field. So how do I set an accounting period to be the current accounting period? Actually, the definition of the period, you give it a start date and an end date. Okay. However, you'll see that on the account period form, you can define what date represents this period. So is it the start date, is it the end date, or is it some other date altogether? I personally like to use things like mid-period type dates because there's no confusion about the first falling into the previous period or the end period. And those of you who are working in the accounting world and you're dealing with sort of 4-4-5 schedules, the first of a month may actually fall in the previous month depending on how the weeks work out in a year, sort of for your accounting calendar. But I like to use like the 15th because that's usually a safe date that says it's the middle of the month. It's definitely going to represent this August 15th date in 2011 represented the month of August for 2011. You set these periods up, you define the date that will be applied to each transaction, and then each period, you come in here and you tell the system, is this the current period or not? So you basically set one of these periods to be the current period. Okay, that's what this checkbox is here. So going back to my example in the system, when a timesheet is approved, the accounting date for that timesheet would be set to whatever the current date is of the current accounting period. So in my example, it would be August 15th, 2011. Quite old, but that's what the functionality would do. So this current accounting period is more of a lookup, more of a dynamic index, and then it simply becomes somebody's responsibility to come in here on a periodic basis, part of your month-end close typically, look at your accounting periods, and say, okay, so we're done with August. Now I'm going to make September my new current accounting period. I would click on the account period name, check the box, and save it. And the functionality in OpenAir will automatically know changing the current accounting period to September unchecks August because you can only have one current accounting period. Okay. So accounting dates and accounting periods work sort of in conjunction with each other. When it comes to rules, billing rules and revenue recognition rules, there's ways to sort of say set the date to the current accounting period as well. But, oops, not what I wanted. But the accounting periods and the accounting dates give you flexibility on how to use yet another date field but have control over what date is put in there versus the date of the action or the way that the data is being entered by schedulers or something like that. So accounting periods and accounting dates give you sort of date control from a process perspective. For those of you who are international or have multiple departments that are using, multiple subsidiaries maybe that are using the OpenAir system and want to have a control of an accounting date, but your accounting period may differ from somebody else's accounting period. Maybe the UK closes their books the day before the US closes their books. There's actually an extended period functionality called current period, which gives you the ability to basically give everyone their own control over the current period. So it's a sort of an overlay extension of the accounting period functionality for those of you who have to deal with multiple current accounting periods. And so if you need more information, we can certainly provide that. So that's great. So now I understand that, if I look at a time entry, there's the time entry creation date, updated date, the time entry date, potentially the accounting date, the timesheet that it's related to start date, the timesheet related to end date, the timesheet create date, and it goes on, right? So what date do I use? Okay. It's a real simple question, but it's actually, the answer is not always that satisfying. Okay. The answer is it depends. And what does it depend on? What date am I supposed to use? It depends on what you want the report to reflect. Is the report being used to reflect your financial policies, where people are not going to get utilization credit, for example, until the timesheet's been approved, and the timesheet has to be approved in this quarter, otherwise you don't get credit for your quarterly metric, for example. Okay? So making sure that something is approved in this quarter, then you're looking at approval dates most of the time, instead of when did you create it or when did you submit it. But then again, if approvals take a long time, maybe you grant some leeway and say, well, you did submit it on time. It ended up getting approved, but it got approved late, so we'll go ahead and give you credit. So all those kind of things are considerations when you're dealing with the date index on reports. Another is the accounting period and metric calendar. So things like I need to reconcile my opening balance and closing balance for deferred revenue with the accounting system. Well, you certainly want to make sure that you're including the right transactions according to the accounting dates that your accounting system is paying attention to. So the accounting date functionality helps support that in quite a bit of ways, even though the way that the date that the invoice was submitted, or the date that it was created, or the transactions associated to it, like the charges, the time entries were 6 months old, you're still doing invoicing for the month of June. Okay. Or if you're doing any kind of other date reconciliations, you're trying to tie out to maybe ADP reports or your Salesforce opportunity closes, anything where you're trying to relate dates between systems, you have to make sure you're talking apples to apples and not pulling a date that doesn't have a relationship to what the other system is tracking. So a lot of it has to do with, well, what are you trying to report? What's the objective of your report? Is it just to monitor to make sure the data it looks like it's clean? Is it to make sure that people are complying with processes saying that you have to submit your timesheet within 7 days of the end of the week? If you want to have an understanding of how is the data accurate between two systems? There's a lot of reasons why you write reports, right? And all of these dates will support those reasons. But you have to make sure you're pulling the right date, because pulling the wrong date, unfortunately, will index into the data differently than you may expect, and now you're spending a lot of time troubleshooting a value that is reported right, but was not the way that you needed to report on it. So where does the date factor in? So this is where we're going to get into the filtering part of the reporting. So I have all these dates, so where can I use the dates? Where do I have to pay attention to the dates? And those of you in the reporting module often, or writing your own reports or using reports, some of this will actually be very obvious because you're like, of course, I see this all the time. And some of it may be like, oh, I didn't realize that's where the control was. So I'm kind of capturing the obvious to the maybe a bit obscure, so that you understand all the different ways that dates can impact how a report is being pulled. So I look at it as 5 main areas of date filtering, if you want to call it filtering. One is on detail reports. That's probably the most obvious one. If you open up any detail report, at a minimum, a detail report has created and updated, the date filters. And those date filters are things like this month, last month, this year, next year, or custom start and end date. The next one, which may not be so obvious, but if you think about it, it's driving the content of the report, is if you're looking at a summary report, it's the primary report period. So that very top thing where you set, what's the period, the number of the period, and do you start or end on a date range. Okay, so monthly, 6 months for this year, starting this year. Okay, so that primary report period does actually drive an index into the data of the dates that are considered for the report. The other that works in conjunction with this is, I call it date index, but it's officially called date to use settings, and these are also in the summary report. So these are areas where you're telling the system what date to consider to include in the primary report period. So these kind of work in conjunction with each other. So if I say I want something this month, which this month is March, then the date index setting will tell me which date I should look at to make sure it's in March. Okay? Things like the submitted date of a timesheet, the accounting date of a revenue transaction, things like that. Then there's a couple of areas that are actually the same functionality, but they're found in 2 different places in the system. And this is called detailed date filtering. So detailed date filtering, when it's enabled, will show up on your summary report. So it's a series of dates. Many of you may have this turned on. It's a series of dates that as you scroll down the summary form, right below you, that whole date filtering and detail field section, you have these series of date range filters, invoice date ranges, revenue transaction, time entries, PO, all these date range filters. And you may or may not be using them, but we're going to go through how you can use them and what they do in the system. And those same date filters are also available on custom calculations. It's a feature that was released about 2 years ago now, I think, which gives you date control over the content of information in those custom calculations. So we're going to step through each of these in a little more detail, show you some examples, and talk about how which things I find useful and some things that you may need sort of ad hoc as you're troubleshooting. So the first one is detail reports. So like I said, this one is probably the one that's the most obvious for everyone. And I picked one of the most robust detail report date filters, which is the time entry date filter. So in detail reports, the whole date control of detail reports is based on the transaction date. Detail reports focus on a single table, basically. And so that table has a series of dates, and it may have an ability in this report interface to reach out to container dates or relationship dates. Okay. So for example here, with the time entry has a relationship to timesheets and tasks. So all of these fields, all these date fields that you're seeing on the screen, up until the very last one that says project, projected, project end date, a bit redundant, I realize. That last date is a custom date field that has been added to our system to support straight line forecasting. Everything before that, time entry all the way down to timesheet created date, these are all standard, these come with everyone's system, standard date fields that are available on the detail report. Okay. So if you're, sometimes when you add custom dates or you add custom fields to the system, you may not actually know it's a custom field unless you just know the system really well. So a little hint that I've put on this slide is if you're not sure if a date is a custom date or not, just open up a detail report for that transaction, and whatever value is showing up after the last created date field, that's pretty much a custom date field. Of course, if you created your own create date custom date field, that sort of throws it off, but timesheet created date is a standard reporting field or standard date tracking in the system. The value after that, project projected, project end date, is a custom date field because it's at the bottom of the list. Okay. From this date filter, you can add things like a date range of whatever's in the relative drop-downs, this year, last year, next year, this week, or you can pick the word custom and hard code a start and end date. Okay. We're going to talk about metadates in just a little bit. Right now, the detail report filters at the top part of the form do not support the metadata values, but we'll see what happens in the future. Primary report period. So this is the start of a summary report. So open up a summary report. The very first part you get is called time periods, and this is where you define the whole time period driving the content of the report. So in our example here, it's monthly for 6 months, starting this month. Okay, and if you look down a little bit farther on the page, I have the value of timesheet all hours. So I'm going to pull all my timesheet hours starting this month, the month of March, forward for 6 months. Okay, so of course there probably won't be a lot of time for April, May, and June because that's all future time. Okay, so this is a date index. This is a date filter, this is a date filter because the time period is controlling what dates I want to see on the report, and then it will look at the value that I want to report on and look at the transactions for those and see if those transactions fall into this time reporting period. Okay, completely makes sense. I'm sure everyone's saying, yeah, I know all this, Jody. The only exception here is it excludes if you are using any module-specific date filters, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. Now, the date index or date to use works in conjunction with that time period. So the time period says monthly for 6 months starting this month on the all hours. And then you go below that option field and you see these date to use drop downs. And for 80% of the time, these are probably spot on accurate, defaulted to the right value. But just to highlight something here is that when you say, I want to look at timesheet all hours for this, for this month, what you have to tell the system is, but what date do I look at when it refers to the timesheet? Okay, because timesheet all hours includes time entry, timesheet, and plus all the dates that are related to those transactions. So if I look at the date to use for timesheet values here on this form, on this PowerPoint, you'll see that I have a decision to make as to which date do I want it to look up for March time. Is it the time entry date, which is for many of you exactly what you want? Is it the timesheet date or the timesheet start date or end date? Is it the time entry accounting date or is it the timesheet accounting date? And that accounting date could be driven based on actions like the timesheet was approved, therefore set the accounting date. Okay. So I often see timesheet accounting date as a value here versus time entry date. For those of you who are wondering, well, what if I set my accounting date process to only set the accounting date when the timesheet is approved? If the timesheet's not approved, what date would it end up using? Because that means the accounting date is blank. By default, if any accounting date field is blank, the system will follow the default behavior of using the date of the transaction. So in this case, it would be time entry date. So if an action that is required to happen or somebody has to manually fill in an accounting date and they're using timesheet accounting date on their report date to use, if that date is blank, it defaults to using time entry date. Okay? And you'll see some of the little hints and stuff around some of these on some of the reports. So same example for date to use for expenses. If I picked expense report accounting date, if that accounting date was blank, it would default to receipt date. Okay. So just be aware of the defaults if you are using the accounting date feature and it's dependent on some type of action happening in the system. Okay. But these date to use work in conjunction with the time period so that it understands, I want March time, but you still have to tell the system what date means March time. And what date means March time for you? It goes back to the intention of the report and the objective of the report. Now, some of you have this functionality turned on and it shows up at the bottom of the summary reports. And I call it module-specific detailed date field. So you'll see a section for timesheet, time entries, and recognition transactions, and expense reports, maybe invoice data. And what happens is you'll see that the list of dates that are in here look very familiar. And actually, it's the same list of dates as if you opened up a detailed report. So if I open up a detailed time entry report, I get all these dates all the way down. Okay. The unique thing about these dates at the bottom of your summary report is it gives you sort of a secondary filter on the information that you're pulling into the report. And it's a secondary filter because what it does is it basically overrides or overlaps the time period that you have at the top of the report. So in our example that I'm going to continue to use, it said monthly for 6 months starting this month. Okay. So if I set an additional filter that says I need to limit the time entries to really just be a very specific time period for this month, I can go down to the module-specific detailed date filters and set that additional detail. The flexibility here, though, goes a little bit beyond what a detailed report can do. A detailed report allows you to pick this month, next month, last week, or hard-code dates. But some functionality in this specific area introduced the concept of metadates, which give you a way to define your own start and end date using a variety of combinations. So in this particular instance, I'm pulling everything from the past up until last week. Okay? And it understands Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So it has a lot more dynamic flexibility in defining what a start and end date range is. So what happens is, in our particular example, I'm running this report, and I said, give me all the hours for 6 months starting this month, okay, all timesheet hours for this month starting this month. And then I put a secondary filter that says, but only up until last week. Now, it's kind of a silly way that I did it, but I'm doing it for example. And what will happen is this date filter at the bottom of the company summary report will actually override or overlap the report time period, and so it will actually restrict the timesheet all hours value to only go up until last week. Okay. You usually don't use the same date to use index that you are using for your primary filter. You're usually doing something else, like give me all time that was created, or give me all time entries that were created in April but approved in the month of August. So you're running an August report and you're looking for anything that just was created way, way, way long ago, and that's like for subcontractor timesheets that are just really, really late in being submitted. Okay. But just know that these work in conjunction with the time period of the report, so you have to kind of keep that in mind as you're pulling the data into the report. And then the same functionality, the same detail field metadata type filtering is also available in custom calculations, which is an advanced concept in reporting, but it gives you the way to create your own calculations in the system and do your own reporting fields in the system. And at the bottom of a custom calculation, you'll have these same type of date ranges with the same type of functionality with the metadata. Okay? The caution here, though, is if you hard code a date range in a value, okay, in a custom field. So let's say I'm going to create a custom calculation for some reason that says May 2015. I'm just going to create timesheet hours May 2015, okay? And I include that May 2015 reporting value on a report. The report has to include a time period that includes May 2015, okay? If I pick a date range before or after May 2015, my custom value that I just included will actually be empty because the report itself has to be in the same time period that overlaps with your calculation. So let's do another example that may be a little easier. I want to understand Q1 utilization. Okay, so I do Q1 utilization, and I hard code a custom calculation that says this is Q1 utilization. I write a report, and I bring my Q1 utilization number in as one of my reporting values. Except the time period I put on the report is Q2. So what will happen is the report will run, it'll give me a column that says Q1 utilization, and all of that information will be blank because the time period on the report was Q2. If I rerun it and set it to Q1, it's going to show me the right information. So you have to keep in mind how you're configuring your custom calculation and the date ranges of your custom calculation, and keep in mind that your date range on the report that you're using that field on also has to overlap with that same date range. So just a caution. And finally, there's a couple of additional dates that are not available to be filtered. Okay, so it can't be on a detail report filter or some kind of time period range or a date to use. But they're very important dates that I think are and very useful dates because you can use them in certain places in the system. And these are those first dates and last dates. So first booking date, first time entry date, last invoice date, last charge date. I really like these dates. They're only available in reporting. They're not physically stored anywhere in the system or visible anywhere in the system other than running a report. But it gives you sort of that natural, well, when did the project actually start? When was the first time entry date on the project? When was the last invoice charge generated? So that was the last of the project. That was the end of the project, for example. And then you can do a date difference between the two and find out the duration of the project. So there is in the custom calculation functionality of OpenAir, you can actually create your own custom detail fields by using these first and last dates and come up with durations, like project durations. Or you can use it to say, what's the average time that people are taking to submit their timesheet. The timesheet start date, or the timesheet submit date minus the timesheet start date gives you an average number of days it's taking people to submit their timesheets. Okay? So these first and last dates are actually really helpful when it comes to sort of doing more compliance monitoring in the system to make sure that things are getting done in a timely manner, or to capture metrics such as how long, what's our average duration for a project. Okay. But these are only available on reports, so you have to just use it for reporting, and then you can do some calculations with them. That's it. You can't do any kind of filtering with those dates. So transactions, in summary, the transactions have multiple dates. I think we all realize they have multiple dates. I wanted to highlight specifically a date that has sort of dual purpose in the system. You can manually control it, but you can also add some automation to it, which is the accounting date functionality. It is a powerful index into the data of the database. And really trying to understand what date you need to use on your report is really trying to understand the intent of the report. What's the policy you have to conform to, and when you're setting up a report, check the various areas. Check to make sure your time periods look right, your date to use looks right, you don't have any or you do have any filters that are module specific. If you're using any calculated fields, make sure you understand how those date ranges, if there's any, are associated. It's really just an understanding of what's driving the value on the report, which of course is what I know many of you are doing and wanting to understand that. So check all of the date filters because that could actually change the values that are coming out on reports drastically, depending on what you're trying to achieve with your report.